just a brief note before I give you, all I'm going to do, I'm assuming people have read the paper, so I'm not going to summarize it or anything. I'm going to give you a context for that I think is a useful context. But before I go into that, just the poem I passed out by Richard Wright, he wrote it very early in life. And a couple of notes about this. One is that the formatting got mixed up, so the title of the poem is on the top right-hand side. But the poem actually begins in the left-hand column and then continues in the right-hand column. And the other comment I want to make about this is the only reason I passed this out, we can talk about it in detail if you like, but there's a big shift in the middle of the poem. The first half of the poem is a description by a young black man who wanders into the woods and comes across the site of a lynching. Right? And if you look at that first half, it's all descriptions of what he finds there, including at the end of that section, a skull, the skull of the burnt body, and the sun is shining into the sockets of the skull, right? And then suddenly something happens in this sort of mythic creation that Wright has, and the person the person who's experiencing this objective structure suddenly becomes the subject of lynching. And he starts getting lynched. And then the rest of the poem is a description from within the self, within the body, of what it feels like to be lynched. And it's the most graphic description I've ever come across, where they pour gasoline on him and he's burning and the blood is boiling and so on and so forth. And the poem ends saying, "Now I am dry bones and my face a stony skull, staring in yellow surprise at the sun." So you see the perspective has shifted completely. The sun is coming in outside, from the outside, illuminating everything. Now, in the second half, we're inside the skull, looking out. And for me, as I will explain in a minute, the fundamental preoccupation I have around the question of death and other aspects of this kind of literature is that I want to map what Fanon called the lived experience of the black, right? And I would say lived experience of the slave, and also lived experience of the death, right? So I don't want to describe death from the outside. It's in a socio-political statistical way. For example, Achille Mbembe has a fantastic article, Necropolitics, but it's all from the outside. It's mapping society. I want to map the second half of Richard Wright's stuff. What does it feel like inside to be the victim of this kind of thing? So that's what the poem is about, and as I say, we can. It's just one very quick graphic illustration of that process. So let me just give you a very brief background to this and the evolution of my work. I wrote Manichean Aesthetics as a graduate student dissertation, and the inspirations were twofold. One was I read Raymond Williams' The Country and the City, where he contrasts the literature and the representation and the politics around the country and the city. And then at the last chapter he says, okay, now England is the city and the colonies are the country, right? And so in my graduate students' days I thought, hey, this could be mapped over, and nobody's explored this possibility. And the second inspiration was, of course, reading Fanon. And he says the colonial situation is the Manichean situation. So the city and the country and the Manichean kind of overlap. And then, of course, the question becomes not country and city, but questions of race and colonialism. So what Manichean allegory does is to compare 3 European writers writing about Africa and 3 African writers writing about Africa. And I chose very deliberately a pair from very different contexts. I chose a pair from West Africa, Joyce Carey and Achebe, in a non-settler colonial context. And then I chose, when I went to Kenya, to choose 2 people from a settler colonial context, Isaacs and Ngugi. And then South Africa, which was at that point still very much an apartheid state, and I analyzed it as a Nazi structure fundamentally. And I had Nadine Gordimer and Alex Laguma. So that was, and it did what it did. My plan at that point was to then say, okay, in the future, I'm going to take this racial comparison stuff and take it to the US. And compare black and white writing about a black experience in the US. And the reason I wanted to do that is that for me, the African-American context, or the American context, the slaves and what followed slavery, Jim Crow culture and so on and so forth, were essentially stripped of their indigenous cultures in the process of being brought over. And that meant that some writer like Douglas, for example, or Harriet Jacobs, could not have access to an indigenous or an original culture which could bolster their subjectivity while that subjectivity was being denigrated by slavery and racism. So what I'm saying is, if you look at Achebe's writing or Ngugi's writing, it doesn't matter how bad the representation of the black is in that or how denigrating it is. Achebe can always retreat into his own culture and say, yes, but my culture validates me in some fashion. And Achebe is mapping the politics of that in his writing, right? But that's not possible for Douglas to do. And I'm not saying that African Americans did not have a culture. They developed a culture of their own under duress. But they did not have a religious practice that was different from Christianity, et cetera, et cetera. And so they were caught in a kind of a strip zone, culturally speaking, right? And my project has always been to use literature to map what subjective experiences are, and I'll elaborate that in a minute. But it seemed to me that slavery provided the starkest of all kinds of structures to map what the processes of coercion were and how they formed subjects and how subjects could resist without any of this other cultural apparatus. So it was a naked kind of a situation. And I wanted to do a comparison, and I thought of earlier on Faulkner and Richard Wright. And they had a kind of relationship. Faulkner read Richard Wright's Black Boy and loved it and said, hey, this is fantastic, but don't do biography, go back to fiction, you know? But then as I got more into it and I read this poem that I just handed out, it was the second part of the poem that made me realize that I don't want to talk about Faulkner. that Faulkner, there's no way Faulkner can approximate that experience, right? He can always talk about it from the outside, which he does very well. But only somebody like Richard Wright, who, as I said in my paper, who said that by the time he was 11 years old in Mississippi, he felt like he had been lynched 1,000 times. And this poem is a perfect evidence of the fact that how he felt like he had been lynched, right? And when he says that, an older brother of a very good friend of it has just been lynched. So and the two people are talking about it, and that's when he makes the comment that I felt like I was lynched. And so for me, that represents perfectly the efficacy of the process of lynching and of death, which is to say that it's death itself, a particular lynching, is horrible for the subject, as in this poem. But what is more important is the threat of death. That in a Gramscian sense, it is the threat that forms the hegemonic structure, right? So you can be lynched at any time, and you have to be conscious of that, and you have to control yourself. And I have partly in the paper an analysis of how do you control yourself? How do you control your desire? So death permeates the subject in a very fundamental way. And so Deathbound Subjectivity, the Deathbound Subject of the book, was my mapping of how Richard Wright explores that. And from the very beginning, Wright is very, very focused, and I don't think very deliberately and consciously, but driven unconsciously into mapping in each novel and his autobiographies a successive layer of the subject as formed by the threat of death. And so he does this in one novel, and the next novel he goes to a deeper layer, and a deeper layer, and a deeper layer, and he keeps going till he gets to the bottom of it, or if there is a bottom to that. And so I saw my book as a genealogy of his archaeology of that mapping. And so each chapter follows his sort of journey. So what the book does, and this is a very brief note on methodology, which may be useful. We could take it up further if we need to. My methodology sort of evolved from the Manichean Aesthetics time by taking into account what Frederick Jameson had to say about the function of literature. When I was a grad student, my dissertation director had posed a question to me. He's saying, yeah, it's all very well, we write these essays and books and whatever, but what is the evidentiary value of literature? And I'd never thought about that, and I didn't know how to answer that. But Jameson begins to answer that. And we read literature and we automatically treat it as if it's evidence for what happens in the world, but we never confront the question of what kind of evidentiary structure there is there. And what Jameson argues is that literature and all art is in effect an attempt to resolve real social contradictions experienced by the writers in an imaginary setting. So things that cannot be resolved in real life, I can imagine a resolution to that in my thinking and in my imagination, right? So literature has something like a dream structure. Freudian, the simple version of the Freudian theory about dreams is what I want, I cannot have in real life, but in my wishes and my imagination, I can have a fancy Ferrari or whatever else it is that I want. And the Jameson's notion is more sophisticated. It's not just wish fulfillment, it's the resolution of contradictions. And so the example I always give when I'm talking about this to students is, everybody knows Jane Austen. What is she writing about? All the time. It's the same damn problem about young girls having to get married and finding a husband. That was the dilemma in her time. And she can't help but write about it over and over and over again. Just as Wright keeps writing about death-bound subjectivity over and over and over again, because this is what haunts him. I mean, if you read that poem, you can see it's permeated him completely. And he has to figure out how to function in that world. So that's the issue. We could talk more about Sartre and his book on questions of mediation. I think it's very, very important and has been forgotten in some ways, right? How do we mediate between economic, socio-political structures and human subjective structures? And that's a problem that Marxism has not, I think, adequately attended to. So when I did Deathbound Subject, I included this kind of Marxian problematics along with psychoanalytic and phenomenological methodology, because what became evident to me in reading Jameson is that Jameson was very good on mapping the political side of the unconscious, but not the unconscious side of politics. In other words, he avoided Freud and psychoanalysis and phenomenology, which I think are necessary to get inside that subjective experience, and that subjective experience as is manifested in a piece of writing. So that literature is an evidence of the psychoanalytic phenomenological construction of the subject, if you will, around the question of marriage, around the question of death, whatever it is. So that's briefly what I did. What this led to then, I thought about, of course, following up Wright in different ways, and there are many, many other representation of death-bound subjectivity. I think African-American literature is permeated with that I thought about. And so starting with Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, I make a brief reference to her in the paper, all the way to whatever. And in thinking about that, what struck me as important to do was to focus on this work that I'm doing now. And the book is going to be called Thick Love, and subtitled maybe one of these, one or two double-barrel titles. But Thick Love is the book I'm writing, is going to look at 5 neo-slave narratives by black women. And all 4 of those neo-slave narratives are focused on the mother's experience of giving birth to a death-bound subject, right? As mother giving birth in slavery to a subject, to a child, that she knows it can be appropriated by death at any moment, and is in fact appropriated. And those of you who read Beloved will know what I mean. How many of you have read Beloved? Relatively few, okay. Let me then outline briefly the novel, because I think that will make sense about the paper. There was the story of Margaret Garner, mid-1980s, 1880s, sorry. A slave who managed to escape from Kentucky to Ohio, and the slave catchers came after her and her family that had escaped into Ohio. And they resisted the capture, but they were overwhelmed, and they were going to be taken captive and taken back into slavery. And the mother, Margaret Garner, who was like 23 years old at that point, decided that rather than let her children, she had 4 children, rather than let them be captured and go back into slavery, she would rather kill them. And she does kill one of them, and means to kill all the rest, and then kill herself. But they stop her after the first killing. Long, complicated story. There was a huge fuss about this at that period. There was a huge set of trials. The abolitionists wanted to use this case to show how horrible slavery was. The slavers wanted this was a test case for them about fugitive slave laws and so on and so forth. And so part of the legal issue became around, and this is part of the paradox, whether this mother could be charged with murder. She could be charged with murder only on the presumption that this child that she killed was a human being and not chattel, right? So if you were to charge her with murder, you would say that the slave was a human being and not a chattel. Whereas the slavers wanted to say precisely the opposite. So they didn't want a trial. So, and this went on for a very long time. Margaret Garner and her supporters lost the case. She was taken back into slavery, and then she disappears. We don't have a history of her, and there's some rumors about what happened. She was transferred to Mississippi, and then the record just goes away. And then that story, as I say, is a very a prominent, very important, sensational story at the time, and then it gets forgotten totally. And then Toni Morrison revives it, right? She finds this notice that she publishes in a book called The Black Book, which is one preacher who goes to visit Margaret Garner in prison and writes about that. And that's the piece published in that, but there's a much more extensive story. Now there's a book called The Margaret Garner Story, where somebody's researched the whole thing. But Morrison decides to write a novel called Beloved about that. And what Morrison does is what Richard Wright does here, is to get inside the subjective experience of that event. And so the novel is fundamentally about how the mother feels after she's killed a baby, right? I mean, and of course she's devastated. And the proposition in the novel is that if she allows the child to be taken back into slavery, that's a form of death for the child, right? And she prefers this other form of death. But either way, life is horrible for her. If she lets the child go back, it's horrible. If she kills the child, it's horrible. And the novel proposes that the killing of the child is an act of love. And people in the novel community are outraged by that proposition. Readers are outraged. I mean, there's a huge debate about can this really be an act of love, right? It's the killing of the child permeates the rest of the community completely. It permeates the mother and so forth. So it is, I think, one of the most brilliant novels ever written, not only about that kind of subject, but about slavery in general. So that will be one of the novels that I examine, and if we want, we could talk about some of the other ones too. I bring to the analysis of this novel, and you see some part of that in this paper, the psychoanalytic issues about eros and thanatos, right? The struggle between the life drive and the death drive. And that, I think, is fundamental to understand, because any slave wants to live. Nobody wants to die. And yet, your desire to live becomes the fulcrum for the slave master to make you a slave. Because as Steve Biko says, right, if you're willing to say, I'm not going to do this, you can kill me, but I'm not going to do this, they can kill you, but they can't make you a slave. If one day all the slaves in America, let's say at a hypothetical time, any point, all got up and said, we're not doing this. You can kill us all. We're not doing this. Well, maybe they could all be killed, but there would be no more slavery, right? So it is your desire to live, your attachment to life, and life is a structure of attachment by definition. That becomes the vehicle for your enslavement. So Morrison's novel is brilliant in doing this at the moment of birth, right? And the moment of motherhood. So that's part of my analysis. The couple of other things about this, and then I'll stop. What Morrison does in this novel is examine the modalities of motherhood. She has two prominent mothers. Setha, the main character, who kills her daughter, and then there are other children who witness this thing as well, of course, and the effect of the witnessing on them. But then there's her mother-in-law, who, and this is a reflection of the actual true story, a mother-in-law who had 8 children, and 7 of them she allowed, I use that word in quotation marks, she allowed 7 of her children to be taken away from her and sold, which is what they want to do with Margaret Garner's sons, right? And so Morrison looks at the cost and benefit kind of analysis, if you can put it that way, of one motherhood that allows her children to be taken, which one can say is, oh, any normal slave mother would do that. But wait a minute, there's Sethe who says, no, that's not normal. And then, so the novel is a contrast between the price paid by each kind of mother, if you will. So that's the central thing, that's not in my paper. But it's a question of compliance and resistance. What is the price and the cost of compliance and resistance in terms of this motherhood? One final thing I would say is about the novel. What the novel does is, I think, map in brilliant ways what, parallel to what I'm trying to, one of the things I'm trying to do in the paper, and what I'm doing in the paper is inspired by Morrison, is this distinction between the somatic and the symbolic, or the psychic, if you will, right? And you know, our bodies have very deep links to our psyches. And what I'm arguing in the paper, and what I would argue more forcefully in a rewriting of this will be part of the introduction to the book and part of the conclusion or whatever, is that the life drive and the death drives are embedded in our bodies, right? So that, like I gave you the example of bleeding, if you cut your finger a little bit, the blood goes there, it heals, it binds the wound, because it knows that if it doesn't, you'll bleed to death. So the body is endowed with a knowledge of keeping itself alive. I think all life is designed that way, right? The fundamental imperative of life is just to live, no matter what. But at the same time, our bodies are also designed to run out of juice at some point, so to speak. They're designed to die. And so our bodies encode the conflict between the life drive and the death drive. And there's a psychic equivalent to it in our heads fighting as well. And I would say just that the body automatically refuses to die. I don't have to tell my body to stop the bleeding. It does it on its own. So just like there's this conflict in the somatic realm, there's a conflict in the psychic realm. And in the psychic realm, there is also this deep desire to deny the possibility of death. And that's what I'm saying, is that desire to deny the possibility of death allows religions, it allows all kinds of capitalism, all kinds of structures to use our fear of dying to manipulate us forever and ever and ever. And so I want to bring that into Marxian analysis, that the threat of death can be thought of either as a means of production or as a factor of production. And I'm right now agnostic as to whether it's going to be a means or a factor, to look into that more deeply. But just one more example of the somatic aspect of this that Morrison captures, right? In the novel, after Sethe, the mother, kills Beloved, and the Beloved has no name, is a young child, has not even been named yet, so she's just called Beloved. And you remember that Freud, when he talks about mourning and melancholia, the name of the missing person is Beloved, right? And Morrison's very well aware of that. So it's about a structure of binding with the beloved, so to speak. It's about love. But Sethe kills this child, and there's a younger child still alive. And the younger child, when both in the real incident and in the novel, after she does that, the slave catchers give up. They say, these people are spoiled. We cannot use them for slavery anymore. And so they just leave. And Sethe keeps clutching the baby whose head she has cut off. So she's totally covered in the baby's blood. And the other baby, the younger baby, is crying, and it's feeding time. And Sethe's mother-in-law, and there's another person there, are trying to persuade Sethe to let go of that body, because she's unbound the body, but she's binding with it, right? And they offer her, they say, okay, give us that body, that dead body, we'll give you this live body, because the body needs to be fed, right? And Sethe finally says, okay, and they make the exchange. And Sethe immediately starts breastfeeding the child. And the mother-in-law screams and says, no, you clean your breasts first, they're full of blood. And she lunges towards Sethe to stop Sethe from doing that, and she slips in the baby's blood. She can't make it. And Sethe then proceeds to feed her younger daughter, Denver, on these bloodied breasts. And as Denver keeps saying as she's grown up, I grew up on my sister's blood and my mother's milk. right? And so blood signifying death, milk signifying life, and the novel makes a huge production about milk. Motherhood is defined in terms of the capacity to give milk for my children, right? Which is to nurture them. So milk is both nutrition, but it is also love, and so on and so forth. And so Denver grows up with the milk and the blood at the structural level. I mean, literally she is fed with life and death, if you will. And also there's this psychic parallel that Denver becomes, in my view, the most quintessential death-bound subject in literary representation. Because she grows up from that moment on, right? With this knowledge, and she lives with the mother, and the novel has the child, the dead child, come back as a ghost, haunting the household. And Denver at some point begins to there's a contest between the mother and the ghost, and Denver begins to decide that if she has to choose between the two of them, she will choose the ghost. So she binds with death in the only way she can. In order to keep alive, she has to bind with death, right? So let me stop there, and then you have the paper. Well, let me say one thing. Yeah, the end of the paper where you have this analysis of Mr. Life and Miss Death and the double helix, that comes out of my analysis of the novel itself. The rest of the paper I wrote just very, very recently, and it's my attempt to think through what will be in the introduction and or the conclusion in some fashion. So.
Thank you very much. Isn't a collectivity, whether it's a collective form of resistance or not, a way of confronting death without fearing it so much, because the collectivity lives on?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be a...
I did take a passage from that after having read your paper. He says, as a rule, it will be found that as soon as the terrors of life outweigh the terrors of death, a man will put an end to his life. That's Schopenhauer. And then from your presentation and your paper, and then again I take verbatim from your paper, only the threat of death will force an individual to agree to behave even temporarily as a slave. That's in page 17. Mm-hmm. And then elsewhere in your paper again you said, given the abject fear of death in most human hearts, the threat is, in my view, the most powerful mode of coercion. So my question is it really the fear or threat of death, or is it the fear or threat of death the most powerful mode of coercion in essence, given that suicide is a fairly common, frequent phenomenon in our world, and then in movies and in real lives, we discover that a man is being coerced, a person is being coerced to do something, say X, and is refusing to do it. But then, under something else, say torture, the person now accepts. Not necessarily, if you're going to kill him, if you point a gun at him, he is not going to do anything. But because he's been tortured, so he concedes. Mm-hmm. Or in some cases, torture even fails. Mm-hmm. So you bring a son, a loved one, and then the man capitulates. So I'm wondering whether the fear of death is as powerful as you seem to want us to understand it in your paper. Because, again, if you look to history, the slaves that jumped into Mississippi River, instead of being slaves, and then the samurai in Japanese, earlier part of Japanese history, death before dishonor, so seppuku. And then in World War II, we know of the number of them, Japanese soldiers and even civilians who refused to surrender, rather than that. So maybe there is another fear, apart from the fear of the fear of failure. If we go into a revolution, what will happen? What are the stringent conditions the slave master will put us if we indeed fail? Kunta Kinte in Alex Haley's Roots, when the slave master recaptured him. Alexander tells us a story of his penis being tied to the tree, and then his leg being tied to a tree. And the question is, will you ever escape again? And then you have to choose between your penis and your leg, which one we're going to cut off. And then Kunta Kinte accepts that it's better he loses one of his legs rather than the penis. So the point I'm driving at is that maybe the fear of death is not as strong as your paper makes it, because we have several incidences where a lot of us often concede to do something we would have done, not because we are afraid of death. And I think the fear of death again arises from some other factor, ignorance. Because the more and more people are enlightened about death, the less and less some of us tend to resolve the fear of death.
Create structures that can be very, very productive. So monotheistic religions have been enormously productive. On the other hand, they've been used in this very, very negative ways as well. And then if we begin to think of capitalism as a kind of religion, then again, you see fantastic productive sides to it, including these computers and so forth. But you also see the terrible sides of it. So the question in my mind is, what are other modes of resolution or combination that can prevent the fear of death being capitalized on in this way for the purposes of accumulation? And whether it's whether it's the pyramids, or the Egyptian culture, whether it's slavery, whether it's capitalism, it's all about using the threat of death for the purposes of accumulation.